Hello everyone and welcome to Green Magic, your source for all things green and magic. Alright, welcome to the first video of the Archetype series. This one will be about Mill. The reason that I wanted to start on this one and do a video on it is because with the Mill mechanic being recently keyworded, as well as that new blue commander that doubles your Mill, there's gotten a little bit of attention to the archetype recently, and it's been covered by other video content creators, EDH Rec, they've all been talking about it. Generally, the consensus is that Mill has not been historically very strong, but that one card might make it a little bit okay or better. I disagree. I think that it's actually pretty good and has been for a long time. I've included it in several decks. For my own personal decks, I have it in Nissa Vastwood Seer, Omnath Locus of Mana, Glissa Sunseer, Thriss Nantuko Primus, Wart, the Raid Mother, and Huatua Honored Physician. I have it in 6 decks, and there's at least a couple more that I could and am thinking about adding it to, and I think that it's much stronger than it's given credit for currently, and I would like to talk about how to make it work really well in green, which is probably one of the best colors to do it in. So let's start with the type that you would not even necessarily think of instinctively, which is forced draw. This one isn't about putting the cards into your opponent's graveyard. This is forcing them to draw the cards. That way they mill out sooner. There are 2 cards that are very similar, Otherworld Atlas and Temple Bell. Both of these make every player draw a card. They're somewhat interchangeable in how they work and how to make them used to mill people out, so I'm just going to refer to one of them primarily, but the combos are applicable to both. So with Otherworld Atlas, what you need to do is find a way to tap it and untap it infinitely. One way to do this is with Elder Druid. This is a creature that allows you to tap or untap an artifact, creature, or land. Now, if you equip that Elder Druid with Illusionist Bracers, then you can tap him to target both himself and the Otherworld Atlas. That way you keep untapping the Otherworld Atlas to put the charge counters on it. You keep untapping the Elder Druid to both untap itself and the Otherworld Atlas. This does, by the way, require infinite mana. That is very important. But there are plenty of other ways to get to that point within this combo. The other choice is Rings of Brighthearth, so that you just pay 2 mana to copy Elder Druid's ability to untap something, and then you're just paying the 2 extra mana for it, which doesn't matter if you've already reached the point where you have infinite mana. The other way would be with Voltaic Key or Galvanic Key. These allow you to untap target artifact. So again, you need the Rings of this one you can't equip the equipment on, so you would need the Rings of Brighthearth. So you just tap, Voltaic Key to untap both itself and the Otherworld Atlas. You keep doing that infinitely, and before you know it, Otherworld Atlas has a ton of counters on it. There you go. Next, I would like to point out with these, you might want to also include Manifold Key. This one says untap another target artifact. So if earlier in the turn you've had to tap the Voltaic Key or Galvanic Key or both for whatever reason, you can use the Manifold Key that you draw later to untap one of those, and then from there you would use the combo with Rings of Brighthearth, which you absolutely need with one of those 2 cards to keep untapping both itself and the Otherworld Atlas to go infinite with it. Now, just right there, you could eventually do sort of the Doomsday, the mutually assured destruction, where we all draw 100 cards and we all lose. Now that's fine in itself, but if you don't want to lose with your opponents, which some commander leagues give you points for, but if you are intending to actually win the game, you would need something like Words of Wilding. Otherworld Atlas plus Words of Wilding, you make all your opponents draw 100 cards, you pay 100 mana to make 100 bears. Instead, you win the game. There it is. So, Underworld Atlas and Temple Bell, they work both basically the same way. They're more or less identical. The difference is that with Otherworld Atlas, you just put a ton of counters on it, and then you have one activation where everybody has to draw a ton of cards. With Temple Bell, each activation is drawing 1 card, so theoretically, your opponents could draw 30 cards and then find some sort of answer, and then do that, and then all the other activations after that won't work the way you want it to or something, but that's pretty unlikely and narrow. So Otherworld Atlas is technically better, but not in a way that's going to really matter. They would need something that either ends the turn and works on an opponent's its instant speed and works on an opponent's turn, or they would need a way to flash in like a Lab Maniac or something like that in order for Temple Bell to be worse or better for them than Otherworld Atlas. The next way is with Thought Not Seer. This one is relatively easy. When it enters the battlefield, a target opponent reveals his or her hand. You choose a non-land card from it and exile it. Then when this leaves, or a target opponent draws a card. Doesn't have to be the same person. So all you got to do here is just bounce them repeatedly and cast them repeatedly. So you need an effect like Gladstone Curio or Temur Sabertooth. And obviously infinite mana. So you just keep playing it, keep bouncing them, and then they eventually have to draw their whole deck. Along the way, you're exiling all the spells out of their hand. So if they do find an answer, you will, by that point, have removed all the other useful cards out of their hand before that. So if they have a way to interrupt your combo, you at least still get to exile all the spells that they've drawn prior to that point that might help them post saving the game. Very simple though. Next is Limestone Golem. This is one that you could do in the same basic way as Thought Not Seer, but you would need one extra piece, because this one you can pay 2 mana, sack it, target player draws a card. So you just force your opponent to draw a card. The extra piece you would need in the same line of play is Eternal Witness. So you play the Limestone Golem, you sacrifice it to make your opponent draw a card, you play the Eternal Witness to get the Limestone Golem back, you bounce the Eternal Witness, and then repeat. That's not how I've built Limestone Golem, and at this point I do want to take a quick moment to say that Limestone Golem is listed on EDH Rec as being in 6 decks. Mine is not yet listed on there because I just added it yesterday. I've been thinking about it for a while. I just added it because I want to be the first person to ever win a game this way. It's only in 6 decks. 2 of them are because of the artist Mark Teeden. 2 of them are Golem tribal decks, and then the others I couldn't figure out. But none of them really care about the card or try using it in this way. So, yeah, I don't think anyone's really seen that line. So the next way, which is how I'm going to do it, in my Huatua deck, is I would need some way to give it haste, either 1,000-Year Elixir to give it the ability to use activated abilities with haste, or Concordant Crossroads, which gives actual haste, Cryptolith Rite, so it could tap for mana, and Mana Reflection, so it could tap for 2 mana. Its ability costs 2 mana, so you will be net neutral on mana as far as what he generates and what his ability costs. But you would still need a way to recur him again. This is why I have it in the Huatua deck, because Huatua allows you to tap him to put a creature from your graveyard on top of your library. And if you have Thornbite Staff attached to Huatua, then when the Limestone Golem dies as part of the sacrifice, Huatua would untap. Then you tap Huatua to put Limestone Golem from the graveyard on top of your library. So you've halfway gotten it back from there. You've at least done the first part of it where you've gotten them out of the graveyard. So, how do you get them from the top of your library back into play? Well, there is a card, Verdant Succession. This is an enchantment that has no use in Commander outside of Huatua. Basically, whenever a green non-token creature dies, and this would apply to your opponents as well if they're playing green, that creature's controller may search his or her library for a card with the same name and put it into play. So, you tap sack Lime Golem to force your opponent to draw a card. You have a trigger to untap Huatua, so you untap him. Then you have a trigger from Verdant Succession to put a Limestone Golem from your library into play. In response to that, you tap Huatua to put Limestone Golem from the graveyard to the top of your library. There it is. Put him into play. You get him back for free, so you don't need the infinite mana to keep recasting him. You just need to be able to tap him for 2 to keep using his ability, and you just keep getting him back for free. Also, because you're not casting him, you don't need an empty stack. You can keep doing this and stacking it up without resolving it one at a time. The other way is another way is with Vizier of the Menagerie. This says that you can look at the top card of your library and you can cast it if it's a creature. So you get them on top of the library with Huatua, then you just recast them and go from there. That way does require infinite mana or other ways to generate an additional 6 mana, which my deck has ways of doing it, but this isn't a deck tech for that deck. So the short answer would be if you can generate infinite mana or just tons of mana, then you would need to keep recasting them. The next card would be Fecundity. This says whenever a creature goes to the graveyard, whenever it dies, its controller may draw a card. So you pay 2, you sack him to force your opponent to draw a card. When he dies, there's a trigger to draw a card. There's a trigger for Huatua to untap because of the Thornbite Staff. You tap Huatua to put Limestone Golem back on top of your library. Then you draw him with the Fecundity trigger, and then go from there. So that happens when Limestone Golem dies. The other half of that, the other side, is an ETB card draw, like Guardian Project or Soul of the Harvest. So you get Limestone Golem into play. Trigger, draw a card. In response, tap Limestone Golem for 2. Use that 2 to sack him to force your opponent to draw a card. That triggers Huatua to untap. So you untap Huatua. Then your opponent will draw their card from the Limestone Golem activation. Then you have your draw trigger still on the stack. In response to that, you tap Huatua, put Limestone Golem back on top of the library. Then you draw it. Go from there. So this, like the Vizier of the Menagerie or the Fecundity, by themselves would require you to generate a ton of mana, possibly infinite, to keep doing it. But there is another card, like the Verdant Succession, that will allow you to put it into play for free. That is Death Render. So if Limestone Golem's in your hand and Death Render is in play, you could equip it to another creature that you're able to sack and then get Limestone Golem into play for free with this. Or if Limestone Golem's already in play, attach this to it and then you're off to the races. What Death Render does is whenever an equipped creature dies, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield and attach Death Render to it. So let's say that Death Render is already attached to Limestone Golem. Tap Limestone Golem for 2. Use the 2 to activate its ability, forcing your opponent to draw. He dies. Trigger. Put a card from your hand with the Death Render. That will be the first one on the stack, the last one you resolve. The second one would be the card draw from either Fecundity or the Guardian Project or the Soul of the Harvest. The third one, which will be the first one you resolve, will be Huatua. So Huatua will untap. Then the card draw. In response, you tap Huatua to put Limestone Golem on top of your library. Then you draw it. Then you resolve the Death Render trigger to put a creature, possibly Limestone Golem, into play and attach Death Render to it. So that's how you keep cheating him into play for free, and you're not casting him, so he can't be countered. And if there's any sort of instance, something that your opponent's doing, like, say, Cyclonic Rift, where you don't have the time or ability to just recast creatures, you need to do it at instant speed. Getting them into play as part of abilities, such as the Verdant Succession or Death Render, allows you to do that so that you can just infinitely go, even with a spell such as Cyclonic Rift on the stack. So those are the things that force your opponents to draw. That's not really actual mill. So let's talk about actual mill. There are 4 cards that I have in my Glissa deck. Tower of Murmurs, pay 8, mill 8. Keening Stone, pay 5, mill X, where X is the number of the cards in that person's graveyard. Grindclock, which is kind of like the Otherworld Atlas, but in mill instead of card draw. Tap to put counters on it, then mill for X. And then Decimator Web, which has your opponent lose 2 life, get a poison counter, mill 6. They will almost certainly die to the poison before mill because they would get 10 poison, mill 60. So that one's more of a infect type thing, or just straight poison rather than mill, but it's also there. Now there is a 5th card that is in the same line of cards that I don't play in that deck, and that is Sands of Delirium. This one is just pay X, mill X. So that one does require a ton of mana, and It's not really something important to me to have in that deck. Now, all 5 of these combo really well with either Seedborn Muse or Unwinding Clock. That way that you can activate them and mill your opponents during each turn. So in a turn cycle, you will mill somebody 4 times for however much whatever card does. So for that line of play, you would just need Tower of Murmurs or Keening Stone or Decimator Web or Sands of Delirium or Grindclock and Unwinding Clock or Seedborn Muse. So that's a way to do it in just a fair, non-infinite way that is a little, it's not as strong as if you did something infinitely, obviously, but it is more reasonable, and especially if you're trying to avoid infinite for some reason. The next couple of things, Codex Shredder, which mills 1, and Millstone, which mills 2, are things that you just can't do realistically, even if you're doing on each player's turn. You have to do those ones infinitely. And the same line would be as earlier when I mentioned with the untap artifacts and the copy abilities. Same thing as that, and you just go from there. But otherwise, these ones will not really be viable without an infinite. Next is Ghoulcaller's Bell. Now this one mills everybody, including yourself. Now milling yourself doesn't really matter because if everybody has 0 cards in their library, you pass turn, your first opponent goes to their draw step, they lose, your next opponent goes to their draw step, they lose, your third opponent goes to their draw step, they lose. It's your turn, but you've already won, the game's over, so you never get to your own draw step to mill out. So if you just want to Leroy Jenkins it, that is an option, but it would be wise to include outs in the deck just in case. 2 choices would be Elixir of Immortality, which if you get that in play, you just mill everybody out, then you pay 2, tap it, you gain 5 life, and then this and your graveyard goes back into your library. So your opponents have 0 library, and you have your full library back. The other one is Conjurer's Bauble, which you tap it, you sack it, you put 1 card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library, so it'd be the only card in your library, then you draw a card. So after drawing it, you'd still have 0 cards in your library, which doesn't seem like it would be fine, but let's talk about Conjurer's Bauble for a second. There are 4 cards I can think of that would go really well with that to save you. Beacon of Creation, which gives you a 1/1 insect creature for each forest you control, and then it shuffles into your library. So you don't care about the insects in this instance, but this would go into your library, so each turn from thereafter you could always just draw it, cast it, put it back in your library, and you'll never mill out. Seasons Past is another one where you could just return all kinds of good stuff from your graveyard to your hand, and this would go into your library. It'd be the only card in your library, and from there you now have all this other good stuff in your hand. You have something in your library so you don't mill out. You're in good shape. Words of Wilding, as I mentioned earlier, it's something that you could always just use to replace your draw with a token instead. You don't necessarily care about the token depending on what deck you're doing, but you're not milling yourself out. And then Elixir of Immortality would be something great in conjunction with Conjurer's Bauble because it gets everything from your graveyard back into. So if you mill Elixir of Immortality, you get it back with Conjurer's Bauble, play it, use its ability to get the entire graveyard back into your library so that you're safe there. So these are things that you would need if you wanted to go the mill everybody route to protect yourself. The next couple cards are Altar of the Brood and Altar of Dementia. I kind of look at them as being very similar, even though they're really not. They do work very differently, but I kind of look at them as being somewhat interchangeable in the decks that I could put them in for my own purposes. But how I've used it and the smart way to do it with Altar of the Brood is go with tokens, because you look at that as being each time a permanent enters the battlefield under your control, your opponents mill that many. So if you're thinking, well, even if I put every permanent in my deck into play, I'm only going to mill my opponents by that many, that's tough to do. So you need the tokens, and the two really 2 cards will get you there in the right deck. Howl of the Night Pack and Second Harvest is what I've chosen as an example. Those aren't special cards. You don't need those 2, but I just want to do a quick example. The deck I'm doing this in is Wart. Suppose I have 12 forests in play, Wart, the 2 Goblin Warrior tokens that Wart gives you, and then Altar of the Brood. Now, those other 2 spells cost 11 mana, so you could, on this turn, whatever turn it is, play your land, play Altar of the Brood, and then cast the other 2. Or if Altar of the Brood happens to already be in play, that's fine too. So let's look at what happens. You cast the Howl of the Night Pack, and you tap your 2 Goblin Warriors to copy it. The copy resolves first, giving you 12 wolves because you have 12 forests. Then the spell itself resolves, giving you another 12 wolves because you still have 12 forests. Then you cast Second Harvest, and you tap 2 of your wolves to copy it. So the copy will resolve first, doubling your tokens. That will go from 2 Goblin Warriors to 4, 24 wolves to 48. Then the spell itself resolves, going from 4 Goblin Warriors to 8, and 48 wolves up to 96. So you gained 6 Goblin Warriors and 96 Wolves. That's 102 tokens that you put into play. Your opponent's mill 102. There you go. You've done it in 2 cards. The way I built that deck and the way you could do it, you would have plenty of other options. Again, those 2 specific cards aren't that important to it. Obviously, things like Doubling Season and other stuff could also help get you there. So now the other one, Ultra of Dementia. This one, it mills only 1 opponent at a time, and it's based on power. So you would need to basically have 300 power worth of creatures to sack, which you could do through tokens. The way I did it in my Omnath deck is just generate 100 mana, sack Omnath, mill somebody for 101. Recast Omnath for 5, so you have 95 mana in your mana pool. He's a 96/96, mill a player for 96. Recast him for 7, so now you have 88 in your mana pool. Mill somebody for 89. There you go. Quick, easy, doesn't require a whole lot of other pieces. It just requires you to generate a ton of mana, which I can do extremely easy in my Omnath deck, and I'm sure you can too. You can find a way, with or without going infinite. Next is a card that I have not yet found a deck for. I'm likely going to put it in Namada, which you can see on the screen right now, but the card itself is Hair-Strung Koto. This one is a 6-mana artifact where you have to tap a creature to mill your opponent for 1. So this one requires you to get 300 creatures in play to mill your opponents out. So you have a few ways of doing that. Now, one way you could go is just with the recursion route. Temur Sabertooth and Cloudstone's Curio, where you play a creature, you tap it to mill somebody, you bounce it back, and repeat. The other way would be with like Huatua, where you get your creature into play, you tap it to mill your opponent, you sack them, you get them back using whatever means in that deck, and you just keep doing the same creature or few creatures over and over. The way that I plan on doing it is in my Namada Grove Guardian deck, where I just create a ton of tokens and double up those tokens and make more tokens, and then from there I can tap a bunch of them to mill. That deck, my Namada deck, does have a way to generate a ton of tokens, not as much as Wart, and there's not nearly as many ways to go infinite. There's only 1 card that will help that deck go infinite. So it won't be nearly as good as what it could be, but the deck still it's not going to have any problem doing it. Now, I also want to show the Altar of the Brood here, because Altar of the Brood only requires 100 things to come into play, and you don't have to tap them. So Hair-Strung Koto does have the weakness of requiring far more permanents, which have to be creatures. It does require you have to tap them, so you can't hold them up as blockers, and if there is something like, Blind Obedience, something that says creatures come into play tapped, that shuts down Hair-Strung Koto. But on the other hand, Hair-Strung Koto has Rebecca Guayart on it, and that to me makes it very playable. I I definitely would love to see this in play in a game of Commander because of that. It's beautiful art, and there are so many of her things that I see, and I say that about it. I look at it and they look awesome, and then I look down and I see, oh, it's Rebecca Guay, of course. So I will probably soon be adding that to my Namada deck, but because it is a tougher card to get to work, even though it's going to be pretty easy in that deck, it's more of a challenge if that's what you're looking for. Now, the last card that I can talk about is Jester's Cap. Now, this one, you pay 2, you sack it, you look through an opponent's library and exile 3 cards. Now, this by itself should see a lot more play, especially in CEDH, because basically you could just exile someone's Thassa's Oracle, Jace, and Lab Maniac, and then that player probably has no other win conditions in their deck. Just as a one-off effect, this could make a target player lose the game. But the idea here is to go infinite with it and mill out your opponents. So the main way that I would like to do this is combo it with Trading Post that you see. This would require me to sacrifice a creature to return this from the graveyard to my hand and then keep doing it. So I would need obviously infinite mana to keep recasting Jester's Cap and reactivating it. But there are other pieces because the Trading Post taps. So I would need to go that same route with the Voltaic Key, Galvanic Key, Elder Druid, where you tap 2 things so that you keep untapping both itself and the Trading Post so that you can keep this combo going. But you also need creatures to sacrifice to keep doing that. So how do I get there? Well, you can either generate a ton of like tokens with an effect such as Namada, Grove Guardian, or other means, or you could use the Trading Post ability to pay a life and create a token. Now that, because it requires you 1 life every time you do that, could drain you out. So you either need a spell that will gain you a ton of life. Here you see Taste of Paradise, where you could just dump 200 mana into that and gain 300 life. Or something like Essence Warden, which just says you pay a life, you create a goat token. The goat token ATBs, you gain that life right back. You're net neutral, and then you do the thing with the Trading Post where you bring the Jester's Cap back, you recast it, you redo it, and then you just exile 3 cards out of your opponent's library at a time. Pass turn, they all lose. The other way, so that's the way I wanted to do it. The other way would either be simple recursion with Eternal Witness and then a bounce effect, Temur Sabertooth, Cloudstone Curio. I could just as easily put this card in my Nissa deck, or a way with spells that will just bring stuff back. In Worth the Raid Mother, for example, you could cast Regrowth to bring this back, then Elvish Cache, another Rebecca Guay art, to bring the Regrowth and the Jester's Cap back. Then cast Regrowth to bring back the Elven Cache and the Jester's Cap. Then Elven Cache to bring back Regrowth and Jester's Cap, and just keep cycling it over and over. In that deck, in my the Raid Mother deck, I do have ways to basically get things back and forth over and over infinitely. Not Regrowth and Elven Cache, but other ways to infinitely get stuff back from my graveyard and so on. But I don't want to go down that route. I don't want to add Jester's Cap to either of those 2 decks because they already have mill plans, and I want to spread these out. I want to do as many. I want each deck to have like 1 mill thing, with the exception of Glissa, which has 4 similar redundancies. But I don't want one deck that can only mill. I'd rather have it as a win condition, as a side win condition, a plan B in several other decks. So let's just look at all the different mill cards that exist. I mean, this isn't all of them that you can play in green. There are more. I know that when they unbanned the Painter Servant, there was the Painter Servant, I want to say Grindstone combo. So there are other mill cards. These are the ones that I talked about. And several of them I've used, and others I could. And if you think that mill is not that strong, I just want to point out and make it very clear, these decks can win consistently, I mean, assuming that no one stops me, using Mill, these decks can win between turn 7 and 8 pretty consistently. So it's not CED8 strong, but it is able to win it is strong. It is just as good as any other strategy in a casual pod. And I haven't even optimized these decks. So you could certainly speed up the clock and make them even stronger and mill just as powerfully as anything else and consistent. With that, I feel like I've kind of taught you a few ways to go about milling green. Hopefully this has kind of opened up some doors for how you might want to do it, giving you some ideas, and also made it clear that it is a fairly strong, viable win condition. With that, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you next time.